And welcome to this crossover edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast and the Locked On Buffalo Sabres podcast. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We're your team every day. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast and Locked On Sabres podcast your first listen of the day. For everyone on the Buffalo Sabres feed, let me introduce myself. My name is Armando Velez, the host of Locked On Panthers. You can follow me on Twitter at MondoMan12. And very thankful to be doing this crossover edition of the show with the host of Locked On Sabres, Joe DiBiase. Joe, how are you doing, man?
I'm good, buddy. How are you doing? Good to talk to you again, especially with hockey right around the corner.
Yeah, it's great knowing that today is when this drops. It's opening night. We have a few games on the schedule. The Tampa Bay Lightning will be facing off against the New York Rangers on the road, and Vegas versus LA to start. Even though we had a few regular season games last week during the day, which I was discussing pre-recording how I was at work during both of those games between the Sharks and the Predators. So great to have some hockey back. And of course, in the middle of the best month when it comes to professional sports, hockey starting up, basketball as well. Football season is in the mix. Of course,
Yep.
we have a Bills Dolphins rivalry in this show, even though we're talking about hockey. But hey,
Yes.
it's a great time. But let's first start talking about the Buffalo Sabres, and of course, it's been a while since they've been in the postseason, but this is the team that has been growing for a few years now. Of course, Rasmus Dahlin has been in the mix for a few years now, but Owen Power, after getting a few games last year for the Buffalo Sabres after finishing the season in disappointing fashion with Michigan, Panthers prospect Mackie Samoskevich was also part of that team in Michigan. But how has the buzz been like with having Owen Power now with the Sabres?
I think it's an optimistic buzz that's in the air with the Sabres right now, and it's led by Power, but it's a couple of different guys. Jack Quinn, who's been their number one forward prospect in the past couple of years, he's ready to make the jump to the NHL level, and he had a dominant season in the AHL, just like historically good for his age bracket. So people are excited about Quinn. They're excited about JJ Paterka, who was a second round pick of the Sabres a couple of years ago, but he's one of those guys that was drafted, and it's like ever since he was drafted, it's he's playing way better in Germany than people thought he was going to, and he's playing way better in the AHL than people thought he was going to, and he made the Sabres opening night roster. So Paterka is a part of that as well, but Power, of course, is the kingpin for the youth movement for the Sabres, and that's what has people excited. Is it's different. It's not we're trying it with the same old core time after time after time, and it's not working. This time it's all right, let's try it with some kids, let's get younger, and let's kind of organically develop it rather than, a couple years ago it's let's trade for Eric Stahl and let's sign Marcus Johansson in free agency and let's just throw these little band-aids at all the problems. Now they built it up through the prospect pool, and there's like waves of prospects that are about to hit the shores in Buffalo. And this is like the first wave. They've got, as you mentioned, Savoy, a couple of other first round guys they drafted in the past couple of years that'll show up in a couple of years. But this year, that first wave, Power, Quinn, Paterka, that trio's got fans super excited for the season.
Mm-hmm. And I was kind of thinking ahead of like the second wave as well for the Sabres, and one of them includes goalie prospect Devin Levi, who they got from the Florida Panthers in exchange for Sam Reinhart as part of that draft day trade last season. And you mentioned Jack Quinn, who I saw 61 points in, I believe, 47 games in Rochester, and in just 2 games he gets a goal and assist last season for the Sabres. But also another player who had a 40-goal season last year in Tage Thompson. There's a lot of criticism going towards the Buffalo Sabres way when they signed him to that deal that was over $7 million a year. But with the cap going up, that is a contract that tells me that there's a belief in this guy. Of course, this was part of the Ryan O'Reilly trade. Of course, he goes on to win the Stanley Cup with the St. Louis Blues, but hey, this could be a situation where both these teams could possibly win this trade.
It'll be hard for the O'Reilly trade or for the Levi trade, because the O'Reilly trade,
the O'Reilly trade.
Okay, it'll be tough to make that an outright win for the Sabres. We could get to win-win territory though, right? We could get to win-win, but it'll never be a win over the Blues. They won the Stanley Cup, and he was
Yes.
the Conn Smythe winner. So it's going to be hard to top that, even if O'Reilly could retire today, and they would be happy with that trade. But yeah, we're starting to come around on that trade in general now because Thompson has developed into what he's developed into. Now, why is there criticism? And I think the criticism is fair. It's because he only did it for 1 year, 38 goals last year, a crazy high shooting percentage that was way higher than any year previous. And typically when you see a guy that's had 3 seasons of, oh, he scores on 9% of his shots, and then suddenly, oh, he's scoring on 19% of his shots, that's a very obvious candidate for regression and not to overreact to the goal total. But where I think it might be different with Thompson is he's playing a completely different position than what he was before Don Granato showed up. He was playing winger, and coaches were trying to put a square peg in a round hole, looking at his 6'7" frame and thinking that guy's going to be a power forward, and that's how I'm going to use him. Front of the net, dirty in the corners, cleaning up the extra stuff. When in reality, Don Granato came in and was like, I don't care you're 6'7". You're not trying to be a power forward. You're trying to be a finesse goal scorer dangler. And Granato said, okay, I'm going to let you get to the open space. How am I going to do that? Center. And it worked because he didn't have a coach that was trying to make him something that he isn't. So that's why I think what he did is repeatable. I don't think I would guess he gets back to 38 goals, but 32, 33, like the low 30s, I think is completely fair to expect from him with, every third year, maybe he has a season where he's approaching 40. But again, there is downside. The downside is this guy did it for 1 year. And if that tanks, you're going to look like idiots because you gave this guy a 7-year contract for $7.1 million.
Yeah. And the 1 year is the hard part to process for I'm sure a lot of people who cheer and cover this team. And also there's a different vibe. There's a different vibe, I feel, as far as national coverage on the Sabres, because all the drama from Jack Eichel has been over for almost a year now. And it's funny because of how our two teams that we cover are connected, because there was also Matthew Tkachuk could have been traded from the Calgary Flames to the Buffalo Sabres last season before there all those leaked reports to influence Vegas to pull the trigger. And then one of the pieces that they get back, in Alex Tuch, upstate New York native, played for Rochester, not too far from where he's from, in Syracuse. And what the other piece in that is Peyton Krebs as well. But the fact that they got a person who wants to be in Buffalo, and we've also talked about it as far as Florida, about people wanting to play in Florida. I've talked about it so many times, but you have a person who wants to be there, from there, who bleeds upstate and Western New York. So I think that's a really cool situation, that not only that they got back out of that drama, but they got a promising player in that.
Fans are very happy with that trade right now. They've done about so far as well as they could. One, the Vegas draft pick turned out to be way higher than we ever could have imagined. We were thinking low 20s, even the 30s, because the Golden Knights were a Stanley Cup contender. For that first round pick to end up 16th, that was the best case scenario. It was never going to be higher than that. So that was good. And yeah, Tuch being a part of the fabric of the organization and the fan base, and he's going to Bills games shirtless. And he's not like up in the suites. Like, he's going in with the rest of the fans. He's waiting in line to get through the little stalls. He's sitting in the stands. Like, he's a Buffalo guy, and fans love that. And I think that's very easy to roll your eyes at. And I have even done that. Kevin Adams, the Sabres GM, has said, we only want players that want to be here. Well, my reaction to that would be, no, you don't. You are going to get players that have to be here, because their only players are going to come to Buffalo right now, with how bad they've been, are draft picks and young players on entry-level contracts. But he found Tuch. Like, Tuch is one guy that genuinely wants to do it. And, of course, it is because he grew up a Sabre fan and grew up in nearby Syracuse. But, listen, it's tough. It's tough to convince players anywhere to come to this organization right now, because, hey, you're Florida Panthers. You mentioned connections. Here's another connection. They just broke the record for the longest playoff drought in NHL history by the Florida Panthers. Florida was 10 seasons from 2000 to 2012. The Sabres haven't made the playoffs since 2011. That's 11 seasons. It's now an NHL record. And how are you going to get people that want to be a part of a team that haven't made the playoffs in 11 years? You got to either be entry-level contract or you got to be from there. So Tuch has been a dream because Sabre fans love him. He's also a good player, and that's a huge part of it too. Is it's not just he wants to be here because he's a gritty leader guy. Like, no, he's also a really darn good top six winger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and projected from Daily Faceoff to be on the second line with Casey Middlestat and Jack Quinn from what I'm seeing.
Yep.
What last question is the goaltending department? Of course, 41-year-old Craig Anderson, former Florida Panther, Craig Anderson, and Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen. I know you've been very high on Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, and I spoke earlier about the next wave of talent coming from Devin Levi, who was a Hobey Baker, who was part of I believe finished in the top 10 in the Hobey Baker voting this past season, if I'm not mistaken. But what's the goaltending department looking like, and your confidence level for them?
So what's funny is like the guy that's the least well-known name on the Sabres right now is probably the starter. In fact, he's definitely the starter. Eric Comrie, who they signed away from the Winnipeg Jets in the offseason. The funny thing about Eric Comrie is he was once thought of as a top goalie prospect. He was a second-round pick of the Jets. But, I mean, Connor Hellebuck just became like an elite goaltender. So he was never usurping that guy. And, a slow development, AHL for a while, and I think he's already 27 years old. Last year, he's a limited sample size. He only plays 19 games because he's on a team that still has, and this doesn't happen much anymore. The days of Marty Brodeurs playing 75 games are long gone, except in Winnipeg, where Connor Hellebuck plays like 65-plus games every season, and that's where Comrie was the backup. Last year, 19 games was all he played, but in those 19 games, he was number one in the NHL in save percentage. Number one. Number two was Ilya Sorokin of the Islanders. Number three was Igor Shesterkin of the Rangers. We're talking about great goaltenders who were below him. But the obvious counter to that is, and why was he so cheap for the Sabres to sign? He did it in less than 20 games. So I think they're hoping that one of two things happen. Either Comrie being, it doesn't have to be, he's not going to be number one in save percentage, but if he plays 45 games, can he be league average? They would take that. I think they're either betting on Comrie, what he did in Winnipeg was real, and it wasn't just a flash in the pan. Or two, they're hoping Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, their number two goalie prospect right now, because Levi has developed really nicely. Luukkonen at some point this season shows up and takes over the net. Kind of similar, I mentioned Shesterkin with the Rangers a couple of years ago. Shesterkin showed up in like January and took over the Rangers net and almost carried them all the way to the playoffs before the season was stopped. I think the Sabres are hoping Luukkonen does that. And Craig Anderson, I think, is here as insurance in case both of those things don't happen. So that's kind of the goalie situation for this year. But make no mistake about it, Devin Levi, who the Sabres acquired from the Panthers in the Sam Reinhart trade, the Sabres just waiting for him to show up. They're just waiting for him to show up. I think right now he's plan A. Luukkonen is plan B. Like, he could become the franchise goaltender. Comrie could even become the franchise goaltender. But plan A right now for the Sabres in net long-term is that Devin Levi takes over that net. It won't be this year, maybe next year. So that's the long-term and the short-term basically for them in net.
And the Sabres definitely have shown some patience with their prospects. That's for sure when it comes to bring him in, from what I've seen. And there's also a connection with Comrie and head coach Paul Maurice for the Florida Panthers during his time. And there's been a lot of questions about whether Sergei Bobrovsky is going to get that many starts for the Panthers as far as the 60, and which I don't think is definitely going to be a thing for the Panthers as far as that many games. But we're going to transition over to segment number 2, where Joe is going to, and I are going to discuss the Florida Panthers perspective on things. We're going to discuss that next year on the show. But right now, we're going to tell you all about Built Bar. If you haven't tried Built Bar Puffs yet, you are depriving yourself of one of life's greatest joys. And guess what? There's a new flavor. Ready? Delicious, indulgent cookie dough covered in chocolate. That's right. Built has done it again. Cookie dough chunk puffs are only 160 calories, and there are a whopping 15 grams of protein in them. Run to Built.com and snag a box for you and the family. It'll be a perfect treat, or you can find a really good hiding place just to hoard them for yourself. Go to Built.com and use promo code LOCKEDON15 to get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKEDON15 for 15% off at built.com. All right, second segment on this crossover edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. And now we flip the tables over to Joe on the Florida Panthers perspective of things.
And it's a very exciting season, I think, for the Panthers. And it's also super interesting because I think for me, Armando, their offseason was the most interesting offseason that any team had because they had a President's Trophy run and they kind of blew things up. Is that putting it too aggressively? When I say they blew things up, really it's one big trade we're talking about, right? It's the Matthew Tkachuk trade. So I guess, one, would you agree with that sentiment that they blew it up after losing to the Lightning and getting swept by Tampa Bay, lose their season ending to them 2 years in a row? And the Tkachuk trade in general, just like, what do you think it signifies for the organization and also like what they gave up to get that done?
Blowing things up is funny because those are terms that I haven't really used on the show, but it makes sense as far as why people could think it's blowing it up, because usually people put negative connotations between blowing it up as far as a team winning this many games, and maybe people use it more in the sense of tanking. That's usually where I think of it as that. But the Florida Panthers, of course, a roster that's still good enough to at least be a playoff team on paper. Especially with the betting odds, thinking of where they are. And of course, the cap crunch really had a lot to do with why they made the trades, and as well as being embarrassed the way they did against Tampa Bay. Yeah, games 2 and 4 were close, and there was a 3 seconds to go, and Ross Colton scores against the Panthers, and it was 1-0 in the final minute of the game for the Tampa Bay Lightning game 4. But for the Bill Zito, it was pretty much a message that this just wasn't good enough. And this core has been here for a long time for the Panthers: Ekblad, Huberdeau, and Barkov. Huberdeau being with the team since 2011. And it just, I know Bill Zito is only in his 3rd year, but of course, seeing the previous seasons and how the Florida Panthers were just not getting over the hump. And of course, Jonathan Huberdeau was up for a contract as next season. And it's like, how can we still maintain our long-term flexibility? Because the flexibility that they have now, I spoke about it on yesterday's episode. They're really tight up against the cap. A lot of contending teams are, and it's still going to take a while for these teams to create some room. So Bill Zito thought about it as, how can I still create some room, at least for the long term? And for the Panthers, it's going to help. It's going to make them suffer in the short term. I was just discussing on yesterday's show about Mackenzie Weegar getting paid by the Calgary Flames $6.25, and Jonathan Huberdeau, their salaries combined $16.75 million, which the Panthers wouldn't be able to just fit. So it was just a move that if you're going to make this move, that time was the time to do it, because the age factor as well. How are those contracts going to age at the end of it? Because Jonathan Huberdeau is going to be 39 by the time his contract ends. Mackenzie Weegar is going to be around that age as well, while Matthew Tkachuk is 24, starting his 8-year deal this year. And when him and Barkov's deal expires at the same time, Jonathan Huberdeau's and Barkov's deals would not have. And that's really the name of the game of how Bill Zito's trying to go with his cap flexibility. And this was even before Keith Yandle's buyout, on seeing how he was structuring contracts. Okay, Duclair gets a three-year deal, $3 million. Okay, there's a Sam Reinhart, a three-year deal. Sam Bennett, four-year deal, $4.4 million. So there's a lot of flexibility that Bill Zito's looking ahead. That's what he's doing. And I get the impression that Paul Maurice is going to have a long leash for the Panthers coming in. And same thing with Matthew Tkachuk and Alexander Barkov together as a group.
Yeah. I think talking about the Tkachuk trade, like, it's just two different teams in two different situations. Calgary kind of had their hand forced, right? Gaudreau left and Tkachuk was going to leave. Like, it was pretty evident, and it was out there in the media that he would only sign a 1-year deal, and essentially you'd be walking him to unrestricted free agency, where you'd lose him then for nothing. So I kind of get it from the Calgary end. I think they lose the trade because you're getting how much older by making that trade. You mentioned the age for Huberdeau, 39 when that contract ends is nuts. But Calgary, like, what else are you going to do? You had two options. You were either going to go scorched earth, rebuild it all, and as a Sabre fan, that could take a decade. You never know. And two, the second option was, let's just go all in, push our cards to the middle. Our hand's been forced. Let's go all in. And I could respect that. But I think Florida gets the better end of that deal because you get so much younger. And I know it was expensive, but I guess how much is the Lightning the bar? How much is the division the bar? Because that's the same team that has ended your season 2 years in a row, but they've been a juggernaut, right? Like they've ended a lot of team seasons the past 3-4 years as they've made these runs to the Stanley Cup. So I guess what's the measuring stick? What's a successful season for Florida? Does it have to start with they've got to get over Tampa Bay?
I believe so. And that's been the mission for this team. And really a lot. I think Toronto is going to win the division, which will likely mean a Florida, Tampa Bay first round. And first round or second round, you got to find a way to get over Big Brother eventually for the Panthers, because they just broke their 26-year drought of not winning a playoff series. Now that record is by the Toronto Maple Leafs. So two droughts that the Florida Panthers have had broken in just the last season. With you spoke about the making the playoffs drought that the Sabres have. So now this is the life cycle of the Panthers, that they are really at their best in franchise history in this 20 almost 30 plus year history of this team. Next year will be the 30th year, but this is the time for the Panthers to still continue to at least get one round for as far as a successful season. And if that one round for me means beating the Tampa Bay Lightning, and I say this now, my mind could change once we get to that time. But right now I'm saying, if you beat the Tampa Bay Lightning in round one, advance to the second round with all the cap struggles that the Panthers are going to go through, because they're going to have around $10-11 million to play with next offseason, and with having the most expensive goalie tandem in the NHL come next year too. If you can get that out of your way, this is that will be a big step forward for the Panthers, and they won't have to have a situation this offseason where they have to squeeze so many players to just get to sign a 1-year deal like under $1 million, or even bring in a PTO like someone like Eric Stahl, who eventually did not make the team for the Panthers too. So that's kind of a situation that Bill Zito finds himself in now. The thing is, short-term pain for long-term gain for the Panthers. But if they can get a round one series win out of it, it's a success.
Yeah. What about the goalie situation? You mentioned it a little bit there. Bobrovsky obviously has been a staple for a couple of years, but Spencer Knight, first-round pick, he's developed, at least I think, pretty nicely. He hasn't broken out as like a superstar yet, but it feels like he has that capability. And he just signs a contract, 3 years, $4.5 million, but doesn't kick into next year. So I don't know, what's the future at that position? Is the writing on the wall that they'll find their way out of the Bobrovsky contract? Because I don't know, Armando, spending almost $15 million on goaltender is crazy in the NHL.
It's nuts. I totally get it. But with the cap rising, a chance of a buyout is less likely, which is such a win for the Panthers. But Bobrovsky still has two more off seasons until that no move clause becomes a modified no trade clause. It's July 1st of 2024 that he will have to submit a 16-team no trade list. So it'll become a lot easier if Bill Zito actually really does believe that Spencer Knight is going to be the guy who's going to take the load past the 2023-24 season and to take the reins. Then that is what the Florida Panthers will have to do. And chances are there's no way in hell that the Panthers are going to keep $0 in salary. That's just not a possibility on earth, in my opinion, unless you give up even more draft capital than what Florida does not have. So that's the situation they find themselves in, and it's a product of the previous regime. The Dale Talon was the one who drafted both Spencer Knight and Sergei Bobrovsky less like 10 days apart from each other. So that's really how that happened. So and Spencer Knight struggled a little bit in his second year, was sent down, had to get a couple of games in, and started performing well towards the tail end of his time in the AHL, brought back up and played a lot better as the season progressed. But right now, I think starting goalie for opening night is still Sergei Bobrovsky for the Panthers, and I think we spoke about Connor Hellebuck in the previous segment about him starting 60 plus games for the Winnipeg Jets under Paul Maurice, and with this stage in the NHL, you mentioned Marty Brodeur, which a lot of Panther fans, including myself, when you look at the stats, say in 2004, Luongo should have won the Vezina over Brodeur because of 900 plus more shots. But those days of the NHL are not here anymore. So Sergei Bobrovsky, I still think he gets about like 50 plus games as far as starting. Spencer Knight maybe gets close to 40, but not over 41 for the Panthers. I don't believe that Spencer Knight will be sent down this season. I am very confident that he will not be sent down to the Charlotte Checkers this year, unless something else happens this season. But I do believe that Spencer will have more time on the Florida Panthers roster. And the thing is, next year is going to be that year to even get more. But I think this year specifically, it's still going to be Sergei Bobrovsky's net.
And then last one is just kind of a check-in on the Sam Reinhart trade from the Panthers' perspective. The Sabres, I think, are relatively happy with the Reinhart trade, but I mean, 5 years before we really know what they'll get out of it, because we're waiting on a goalie, and goalies can sometimes take forever to develop, as you're starting to find out with Spencer Knight. Ryan Miller, once upon a time, didn't show up for the Sabres until he was 26 as the starter. It could take a long time. What about from Florida's perspective? Statistically, it was a great year, but did Reinhart, I guess, meet the expectation of what the team was getting?
And you mentioned Ryan Miller, one of the best American goaltenders of all time there for the Sabres. And for Sam Reinhart, he got off to a rough start for the Panthers, only 1 point in 6 games. I know there was a Buffalo writer speaking about that trade very early for the Sabres, saying how they guaranteed that the Sabres would win that trade. But of course, Sam Reinhart ended the season with 13 power play goals for the Panthers. He has continued being a net front presence for the Cats, and especially because he was a big mentor to someone like Anton Lundell last season, playing on the same line. Him, Mason Marchment, and Anton Lundell. That was a line that had a streak of everyone at least getting a goal. And there was a game against Columbus last year where each of them had at least 5 points in their game against Columbus. I believe it was a late January, early February game in Columbus. So that has been a relationship that progressed a lot last season. However, Sam Reinhart, with the new coaching staff, of course, is not going to be on that same line for the Panthers. He's actually, as far as practice lines this morning, the Panthers look to have Alexander Barkov with Sam Reinhart and Carter Verhaeghe. And Sam Reinhart was playing on the top line opening night of last season, and was even within a period, he was shifted down to third line and really didn't leave that spot since. But that was still a very productive line. You had one of the best top nines in the NHL, of course, one of the best scoring seasons that we've seen in the NHL since the 1996 Penguins, and of course, with a lot of changes and cap strap, of course, you gotta spread the lineup a little bit differently, and of course, different familiarities and different coaches and different philosophies go to different decisions. With Sam Reinhart being on the top line, who knows? It could change for the Panthers, but right now, opening night, it looks to be that Sam Reinhart is going to play on the wing along with Barkov and Carter Verhaeghe.
All right. Well, I think that's it for me on Panther questions. Want to take a break and then come back and look at some other stuff?
Yep, we'll take a break, and each Joe and I will be discussing our own teams on who the surprises between who makes the roster and who did not make the roster for each of our individual teams. We'll be discussing that next here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast and Locked On Buffalo Sabres.
All right, welcome back to the Locked On Sabres podcast. Good chat there with Armando of Locked On Panthers on one of the Sabres divisional opponents. We'll talk more about the other divisional opponents of the Buffalo Sabres in the Atlantic Division on our next show. But a couple of takeaways here from the Buffalo Sabres, their opening night roster. Opening night, not quite the lineup, I guess, but we do kind of know the lineup at this point. That's why I don't know how to phrase it. We know the roster officially, and we unofficially know the lineup. Going into the season, a couple of roster cuts, you could call them, more being guys being sent down. Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen to the Rochester Americans, so he will not start the season in Buffalo. I thought there might be some chance that he does. He will not. It'll be Craig Anderson and Eric Comrie to begin the season in net for the Sabres. But I do wonder if Luukkonen, after a couple of weeks, a couple of months, is going to take over the Sabres net, or at least take over the backup spot in the Sabres net. So we'll see if that ends up happening, but he is going to begin the season in Rochester. He was sent down. Also sent down to the minors was Lawrence Pilot, defenseman who is back after a couple of years in Europe. He is, I think, the 8th defenseman right now in terms of injured guys and whatnot, but it will be Casey Fitzgerald. That is the 7th defenseman for the Sabres going into this season. Thinking about the lineup, though, in terms of what we're looking at for pairings and defensemen, Skinner, Thompson, Olofsson looks set in stone. Casey Mittelstadt, Alex Tuch, and Jack Quinn is set in stone, as well as Dylan Cousins, Peyton Krebs, and JJ Paterka. Nice little kid line there. Rasmus Asplund, Zemgus Girgensons, and Kyle Okposo. On the blue line, Matthias Samuelsson, Rasmus Dahlin, Owen Power, Henry Jokiharju, and Jacob Bryson, Ilya Lyubushkin. The most interesting thing, though, about the Sabres practice this morning was their power play units. We have our first look at what the Sabres are going to do on the power play. A lot of expected, but one thing that was unexpected that I didn't love. The top unit, Alex Tuch in front of the net, Tage Thompson on the left wall, Jeff Skinner in the high slot, Rasmus Dahlin at the point, and Casey Mittelstadt on the right wall. Not the biggest fan of Mittelstadt on the power play because he doesn't have a very hard shot. I think it's going to be his off wing, and his playmaking skills are fine, but I wonder if this is just a ploy by Don Granato to get Mittelstadt rolling, get him going as the season begins. But I would have much preferred Victor Olofsson on that side on the power play, maybe even Peyton Krebs, Cousins, Okposo. I think there were 4 or 5 guys I would have liked on that power play unit over Casey Mittelstadt. The second power play unit, Kyle Okposo at the net front, Peyton Krebs on the left wall, Dylan Cousins high slot, Victor Olofsson right wall, and Owen Power on the point for the second power play unit. No problems there. I would have liked one, of course, in place of Mittelstadt on the top unit, but all good here. But Mittelstadt would be the one criticism I'd have of Granato's lines there. All right, next episode will be an Atlantic Division preview. We got the scoop on the Panthers. We'll go through the rest of the division on our next show. So thanks everybody for listening to the Locked On Sabres podcast, making us your first listen every day. Now go make your second listen, Locked On NHL. The NHL season gets underway Tuesday night, and they'll be talking all about it. 30 minutes, your daily 30-minute podcast on the National Hockey League. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts.